Hello, good morning to everybody. And for some of you, it's maybe a good afternoon. And for most of our presenters, it's actually a good evening as well. So hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar entitled Leading with Humility, Global Perspectives and Personality Insights. This webinar is actually brought to you by Optima Consulting Group, OCG, in partnership with Hogan Assessments Incorporated in the US. During this webinar, we're going to find out about humble leadership. We are going to have some Asia-Pacific perspectives about leading with humility, as well as get a glimpse of how to leverage on Hogan personal insights on how to enhance on leading with humility in our midst. My name is Jeannie. I am the principal consultant at Optima Consulting Group, and I will be your host today. With me, I have our partners from Hogan Assessments. In Asia Pacific, right? So the Asia Pacific team, right, includes Crystal. So Crystal is actually the managing director for the Asia Pacific team. And of course, with her, supported by Anne-Marie, regional manager, Nicole Dickey, so senior consultant for international distributors, as well as supported by Renyu. Additionally, I also have some colleagues from Optima Consulting Group. So some of them you are already familiar with. So, they will actually say hi either during the webinar or even subsequently after the webinar. And of course, I have our lovely speakers from Hogan Assessments. Jessica McDuffie, Senior Consultant, Talent Analytics. Nadine Malioko, Consultant, Data Science, as well as Zena Hustov, who's actually the Research Consultant for Data Science. So let me start with a quick introduction of Optima Consulting Group. Right. So Optima Consulting Group has begun serving our clients, our first client in Singapore in August 2002. Since then, we have expanded our presence to Kuala Lumpur, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Tokyo, supporting multinational corporations, as well as Asia-Pacific-based companies across Asia and beyond. It's a pleasure to see many familiar names amongst you. So thank you for the trust and opportunities you've extended to Optima Consulting over the years. We look forward to deepening our partnership with even more of you in the future. Next, let me introduce to you Hogan Assessments and our distinguished speakers. So as some of you would know, Hogan Assessments was launched in 1987. They have since assessed more than 11 million people around the world in 53 languages, conducted more than 1,500 research studies, and certified more than 55,000 users, of which quite a few of you are certified users. Jessica, that's where I will actually talk a little bit about our distinguished speakers as well. So let me start with Jessica. Jessica McDuffie. Jessica McDuffie is actually a PhD, is a senior consultant at Hogan Assessments, specializing in fair and data-driven talent analytics, including selection, development, and team effectiveness. Say hi, Jessica. Okay, and Nadine. Nadine is a PhD, also a talent analytics consultant at Hogan. That for her, she focuses on leadership and personality research with prior experience at Yale and active involvement in SIO. Say hi, Nadine. And
hi,
Zena.
Everyone.
Thanks, Nadine. Zena is a research consultant on Hogan's data science team, with expertise in research, infrastructure, and data visualization, and applied personality studies. She's currently pursuing her PhD in organizational psychology. Hi, Zena.
Hello, everyone.
Okay, so some housekeeping rules, right, before I hand the mic over to our presenters. To all of you, please remain muted during the presentation. If you have any questions, kindly scan the QR code, which afterwards will be given to you. Kindly scan the QR code to access the online Google survey form. I will gather these questions and do my best to ensure all are addressed during the Q&A segment at the end. The presentation will last approximately 14 minutes. Following the presentation, we will allocate some time for the Q&A section. After the webinar, expect an email from my colleagues containing a brochure and contact details for any questions. So I think those are the few things that I just want to very quickly highlight. Then let's start the presentation. So leading with humility to any of the presenters.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for that lovely introduction. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. We're excited to be here talking about humility, global perspectives, and personality insights. And here's kind of how we're going to spend our time together today. Jenny alluded to a few of these things already, but we will begin this presentation by defining humble leadership, drawing on a variety of perspectives. We will then debunk myths about humble leadership, clearing up some common misconceptions about humility in leadership. Next, we will leverage insights from our Global Leadership Effectiveness Study to examine APAC perspectives on leading with humility. And lastly, we will leverage Hogan personality insights to link scales to humble leadership and note some behavioral recommendations for developing humility in leaders. And as Jenny mentioned, we will also be sure to leave ample time at the end for questions. So feel free to scan the QR code that is on this slide and submit your questions as we go. So let's get started by looking at how different sources define humble leadership. Looking from a general public perspective, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, humility is defined as the quality of being humble or having a lowly opinion of oneself. Meekness, lowliness, humbleness. The opposite of pride or haughtiness. Merriam-Webster similarly defines it as freedom from pride or arrogance, the quality or state of being humble. And dictionary.com defines humility as the quality or condition of being humble, modest opinion or estimate of one's own importance, rank, etc. So when we look at how humility is defined in everyday language and in dictionaries like these, it often sounds non-leader-like, even self-deprecating. Words like lowly, meekness, and a low estimation of one's own importance seem to suggest humility is about shrinking oneself. If we stop here, humility can seem incompatible with leadership. But this view is largely outdated. Modern leadership research has begun to redefine humility as a strength. Specifically, humble leadership researchers have consistently identified 3 consistent observable behaviors that define humble leadership. These involve a willingness to have an accurate view of oneself, acknowledging both strengths and limitations, an appreciation of others' strengths and contributions, as well as an openness to feedback and new ideas, as well as a willingness to learn. Similarly, the Hogan competency model also defines humility by 3 key behaviors. These include displaying modesty, acknowledging limitations, and seeking feedback. This Hogan competency was identified as part of a comprehensive development process aimed at understanding how personality relates to commonly used workplace competencies and represents how humility is defined across academic, commercial, and government competency models. So now we've moved from seeing humility as a weakness from sort of a general perspective to understanding it as a strength through the academic research, and now from Hogan's perspective as something measurable and actionable.
Now that we know how humility is defined, we are going to shed more light on the ins and outs of humble leadership. To do this, we will go through 5 myths, debunking each myth along the way. Dr. Hogan often talks about the difference between emerging as a leader versus being effective as a leader. And so, our first myth regards humility and leadership emergence. Specifically, myth number 1 is humility hurts being perceived as a leader. As Zaina highlighted, the general public tends to describe humility in a way that is counter to the way we describe leaders. When describing humility, we tend to consider aspects such as having a lowly opinion of oneself, being meek, and having a low estimation of one's importance or rank. When describing leaders, we tend to consider aspects that seem almost like opposites, such as being confident, assertive, and maybe even strong willed and commanding. However, over the last 20 years, we've better understood that humility encompasses aspects like being better aware of what you know and what you don't know, and realizing you don't always have to have the answers to questions. There is power in leaning on others to be effective in your leadership role. This idea of humility becoming more of a strength rather than a weakness in leaders really came to light in the early 2000s with books like Good to Great by Jim Collins entering the mainstream. Since then, organizational researchers have increasingly attended to the power of humility in leadership. Now, we'd like to recognize that humility is not easy to detect in individuals. It's subtle and it takes time to notice in others. Arguably, we observe aspects that are counter to perceptions of humility more quickly than we do humility itself. For example, aspects like arrogance or self-deprecation may be quickly or more noticeable than humility. But over time and through assessments, we can identify those leaders who are likely to demonstrate humility. Similar to our first myth, our second myth regards leadership emergence as well. Specifically, myth number 2 is humble leaders are not confident. Here, we drill further into the world of humility and leadership emergence. As we've discussed, it seems like humility means lacking confidence. I would imagine it's easy for someone to draw this conclusion quickly if they heard their leader say, "I'm not sure," or "I don't have the answer." However, just because we may make this association does not mean it's always right. We have to remember that our understanding of what humility is and isn't has improved over the last 2 decades. Humility does not mean having a lowly view of oneself. It means having an accurate view of oneself, one's strengths, and therefore one's limitations. Additionally, our research at Hogan shows that humility and displaying confidence are positively associated. This makes sense when we know a person can be confident while saying they are not sure or they don't know something. We argue it's what a leader does with that awareness of their limitations that is key. A leader's options could be to evade the situation, to dismiss others to make themselves seem superior, or to distract others from their lack of understanding or knowledge. Or the leader could take the option that would demonstrate humility. They could seek others' feedback, or they could lean on others to help fill the understanding or knowledge gap that is present. By acknowledging, appreciating, and being open to the contributions and strengths of others, a leader can become someone others are more willing to follow. And so ultimately, we recognize that a leader can and should be both humble and confident. At this point, we have covered myths pertaining to humility and leadership emergence. But let's now debunk myths around humility and leadership effectiveness. Our third myth is humble leaders are not effective. As you may have noticed, humility can be a strength in leaders. And this isn't something that we're just saying. It's something organizational researchers continue to find in their research studies as well. Research shows that humility not only predicts effective leadership, but has also been linked to several positive outcomes for employees. For example, it's been linked to higher job satisfaction and higher affective commitment, or one's emotional connection to their organization. It's also been linked to greater levels of creativity and voice, or one's willingness to share their thoughts and ideas. It's also been linked to greater organizational citizenship behaviors, or voluntary behaviors that help the organization and go beyond one's job requirements. Lastly, it helps with an employee's general performance. But as Dr. Hogan has pointed out before, highly effective leaders are not just humble, they're fiercely competitive too. And so it's important we remember that humility is just one component of effective leadership. In addition to humility, displaying confidence, being competitive, and possessing attributes that allow a leader to drive a business forward are incredibly important too.
So this leads us to our fourth myth, that humble leaders can hurt the recognition of teams. If people who are high on humility are less likely to focus on themselves, they may be perceived as someone who's going to neglect to find ways to get the team to be recognized by the organization. And since humble leaders may not seek out recognition necessarily, and they want to and want that spotlight, there's this concern that these leaders may not get the organization to recognize their team as the organization should. However, while humble leaders are free of pride, this may not mean that they will not make the efforts to ensure others shine. So when a team has a leader with no humility, this leader tends to own all of the team's achievements. They tend to be closed-minded towards others' opinions and lack accountability for their own behavior. This negatively impacts the team by having lower team psychological safety. People feel their ideas are not valued, and the leader could possibly shame them for some of their ideas, leading them to share less of their ideas and feeling less safe. So there is this decreased team trust ultimately that emerges as the team lowers their trust in their leader. So with little trust, the team will experience lower team cohesion and collaboration. An arrogant leader who loves their own ideas and wants to be the center of attention does not create a high-performing team. So rather, the team may experience greater turnover, lower job satisfaction, and lower team morale. And actually, a study found that 28% of people who left their jobs pointed to a negative relationship with their manager as a key reason for quitting. On the other hand, when we examine a leader with humility, we see a different story. So humility has been found to be a key component in successful teams. Humble leadership fosters shared credits. So when the team leader receives credit, the leader is more likely to recognize their team as well. Additionally, team members feel their voices and opinions are heard, valued, and considered. So team trust is enhanced as people learn to trust the team leader and feel as though they can safely express their thoughts and ideas. A humble leader is more likely to create a psychologically safe and inclusive climate. This further enhances team collaboration and team morale. And research has found humble leaders to create stability and engagement within teams. So as humble leaders empower and support their teams are able to deliver on results, demonstrating they are high performers, gaining a positive reputation, and increasing visibility within the organization. And then our fifth and our final myth that we want to debunk is that we have been highlighting the positive attributes of a humble leader, and it seems as though this leadership style will fix all teams and is effective across all organizations. While there are a plethora of positive qualities to a humble leader, there may be some situations in which a leader may not want to lean in with more, or maybe lean in with less humility. So research has shown that humility is great for leaders who need to have their team members be creative, brainstorm new ideas, and create innovative solutions. When teams need to be able to openly share ideas, feel safe to voice their opinions, and generates a lot of ideas, humble leaders create great environments for those teams. And Moreover, for teams who need to be flexible and adjust frequently and swiftly, whether it's due to a constantly changing market or taking new risks, research has found that teams with humble leaders who are willing to accept feedback and act on that feedback create really great environments for those teams as well. And then finally, with this third bullet point, humble leaders are really great for teams and organizations where there is a low power distance structure. So when organizations have a flat hierarchy, humble leadership excels in its natural elements. When the organization has a flat hierarchy, there is greater anticipated egalitarianism. Research has even shown that when leaders demonstrate humility in these environments, this fosters greater knowledge and information sharing within the team. And those teams were found to be more creative. On the other hand, a leader may choose to lean less into humility in other situations. So research has shown there are times when leader humility is not conducive for effective teams. For example, when there is a crisis that needs to be immediately addressed, research has shown that a leader should lean less into humility because decisions need to be made urgently, swiftly, immediately. And then additionally, when a team is in an uncertain environment or time, such as, for example, the future of the team is ambiguous, research has shown that a leader who leans less into humility may be more beneficial for that team at that specific time. And then finally, when there is a high power distance in an organization and team members anticipate a hierarchy and thus a leader who is dominant and powerful, a leader may choose to exude less humility so as not to appear undecisive and create doubt among their followers. So there are times and places when demonstrating humility will be beneficial, or times when it could be detrimental to the team. So a leader needs to know when to flex one's humility and when not to, because there are times when they need to show less humility and other times when they need to show greater humility in their leadership.
Now that we have a stronger understanding of the ins and outs of humble leadership, we want to present our research that extends our understanding around the context of leading with humility from an APAC perspective. Specifically, we set out to answer the question, according to APAC perspectives, is humility key to ideal leader perceptions? To address this question, we asked working adults from companies in the APAC area to complete a 15-minute survey. This work was part of a broader data collection effort known as the Global Leadership Effectiveness Study, or GLESS. The study involved asking employees around the world to indicate what made an ideal leader according to Hogan's 62 competencies from their Hogan competency model. Participants rated these competencies, these 62 competencies, on a scale from 0, not important for being an ideal leader, to 4, extremely important for being an ideal leader. And so, the research we present today could not have happened without the hard work of Hogan's GLESS study team and the recruitment efforts of companies and distributors we work with around the globe. Now, our sample for this research consisted of 2,056 working adults currently living in the APAC area. Of these 2,056 working adults, 50% were women. The age ranged from 19 to 75. 63% were leaders, and 37% were individual contributors or not in a leadership role. Participating working adults covered 9 APAC countries. They included Australia, India, Indonesia, Japan, mainland China, the Philippines, Taiwan, Greater China, Thailand, and Vietnam. And finally, participating working adults covered over 22 industries. Now, when we asked APAC participants to what extent humility, according to Hogan's perspective, is necessary for being an ideal leader, we learned that humility ranked 52nd out of the 62 competencies evaluated. Now, that seems like humility is ranked relatively low, but it's worth noting that participating working adults rated humility on that scale from 0, not important for the ideal leader, to 4, extremely important for being an ideal leader. The average rating for humility across all 9 APAC countries examined was around 2.92, suggesting humility was considered important for being an ideal leader, just not as important as other competencies they rated, such as decision making, accountability, or communication, for example. And as a reminder, this GLES effort was a worldwide research initiative, and we had over 90 countries participate in this GLES study, actually, including the 9 APAC countries just mentioned. So to put this 52nd ranking from the APAC countries into context, when we examined all 90 plus countries from our GLES dataset, we found humility ranked 48th out of the 62 competencies examined. Not too far off from that 52nd ranking. And again, overall, humility was considered important, just relatively not as important as other competencies, for example, like communication. Now, we did not want to leave our results at just that overall ranking because context, as we've discussed, is important to keep in mind. So we set out to address the question, do perceptions of humility differ based on the perceiver's gender, that is, for the ideal leader? We found that the answer was no. Perceptions of humility for the ideal leader did not differ depending on whether the participant indicated they were a man or a woman. We also set out to address the question, do perceptions of humility differ based on the perceiver's job level for the ideal leader? After examining differences across job levels, we found that the answer was yes. Perceptions of humility did differ depending on the participant's job level. Specifically, we found that executive leaders viewed humility as more important for the ideal leader compared to the other job levels examined, specifically middle managers, frontline leaders, and individual contributors or non-leaders. Lastly, we set out to address the question, do perceptions of humility for the ideal leader differ based on the perceiver's APAC country that they reside in? We found that the answer was yes. Humility seemed to be relatively more important for the ideal leader to participants in countries like Japan, Australia, and India, and relatively less important in countries like Vietnam, Taiwan, and mainland China. And for context, we want to remind everyone that the average ranking across the 9 APAC countries examined had humility at 52nd of the 62 competencies evaluated. So you can see here that Vietnam, Taiwan, and mainland China fall below that threshold. So what does this all mean? Our hope was to provide a more global and APAC-specific perspective of where humility stands for the ideal leader through our research. Now, despite finding that humility ranks relatively lower compared to other competencies, we found that the importance of humility differs depending on context for the ideal leader. That is, we found that executive leaders perceived humility as more important for the ideal leader compared to all other leader levels. We also found that APAC countries value humility in leaders overall, but just not as much relative to other competencies such as decision-making, accountability, or communication, for example. Now, why does this all matter? Although we don't necessarily have samples that represent every working adult in every APAC country, our results still point to the value of considering context. Given our results pointing to the importance of context, we encourage organizations to assess whether leader humility is important for a leader's performance, as well as whether leader humility is valued in an organization. This information may help dictate how we approach developing humility in leaders. Lastly, we'd like to conclude that leaders should remember that humility isn't a universally expected leadership aspect across countries. It's important to be aware that there are cross-cultural differences in perceptions around leading with humility.
All right, so we now know humility isn't one size fits all. It is very context dependent. But while context matters, so do the people themselves. Individual personality characteristics also play a key role in how humility shows up day to day. By leveraging Hogan personality insights, we can start to better understand humility and how to develop it more intentionally in leaders. So our 3 rigorously validated assessments, the Hogan Personality Inventory, the Hogan Development Survey, and the Motives, Values, Preferences Inventory are systematic measures of the bright side, dark side, and inside of personality. More specifically, the HPI describes everyday strengths and weaknesses that provide insight into how people will work, lead, and achieve success in their careers. It assesses how someone will be seen by others on a day-to-day basis. The HDS identifies overused strengths. Unmanaged, these behaviors can degrade leadership effectiveness, erode the quality of business and personal relationships, as well as derail careers. The MVPI concerns personal goals, interests, and drivers. These values and motives will energize someone to the extent that they will enjoy a job, career, or organization when they are satisfied, or they will potentially cause someone to leave a job, career, or organization when they are not. In other words, the MVPI provides a measure of fit. So in sum, these assessments help us understand if someone can do a job, what might get in their way, and whether they will like the job. So to explore how the HPI, HDS, and MVPI align with humble leadership, we applied a 5-stage process. To start, 3 Hogan researchers dove deep into the academic literature on humble leadership, focusing on articles that explored how personality and specific competencies contribute to humility in leaders. From there, we turned to Hogan's own data, beginning first with data collected via our custom client research. Specifically, we reviewed criterion-related validation studies, examining how personality predicts humility, analyzing data from over 2,000 job incumbents. We also analyzed the relationship between Hogan's personality scales and humble leadership, utilizing data from 294 participants collected by our data science team through an online research platform as part of a broader study. Next, we tapped into Hogan's reputation research. Here we analyzed data from over 1,000 participants to better understand the personality characteristics of individuals who tend to be perceived as humble by others. And finally, by integrating insights from the academic literature with the findings from these various data sources, we identified 9 Hogan personality scales that best capture what humble leadership looks like, both in theory and in practice. So starting with the HPI, we identified higher interpersonal sensitivity, higher prudence, and moderate learning approach as important scales for humble leaders. Leaders who score higher on interpersonal sensitivity tend to be cooperative, diplomatic, and communicate with warmth. That aligns closely with humility because humble leaders are approachable, team-oriented, and as was mentioned earlier, fosters psychological safety. People feel heard and respected around them. Leaders who score higher on prudence tend to be honest, dependable, and hold themselves accountable for mistakes. As you may recall, humble leaders aren't impulsive or self-serving. They take accountability for their mistakes and are honest about their limitations. And leaders who score more in that middle range, or what we call moderate on learning approach, tend to seek self-development opportunities and are interested in applying that new knowledge on the job. This aligns with humble leadership because humble leaders remain open to learning and growth so that they can better support their team. Turning to the HDS, we identified lower skeptical and leisurely and moderate bold as important scales for humble leaders. Leaders who score lower on skeptical and leisurely tend to build trusting relationships, listen to others' ideas, be open to multiple perspectives, as well as be genuine, direct, and open to feedback. As you may recall from the definitions and behavioral indicators of humility, humble leaders are open to others' ideas, alternative perspectives, as well as feedback, aligning very closely with the lower ends of these two scales. Moderate bold is associated with being confident and assertive while also balancing a realistic view of oneself. As Nadine noted earlier, humble does not mean not confident. The key is having an accurate self-view. So humble leaders will project self-assurance without arrogance. And lastly, for the MVPI, we identified moderate recognition and power and higher altruistic as important scales for humble leaders. Leaders who score in the moderate ranges of recognition and power will value opportunities to be noticed, but also recognize the achievements of others, just like they will value working together and lead with an emphasis on achieving shared goals. What we see in humble leaders is really a balance across these values. They're not chasing the spotlight, but they're comfortable stepping into it when it helps the team. And they're driven to make an impact, but it's about we, not me. And finally, leaders who score higher on altruistic value supporting others' development and success. This genuine motivation to serve others and contribute to something larger than themselves is a hallmark of humility in leaders.
With a better understanding of how personality relates to humble leadership, we now ask, what are some things leaders can do to develop themselves as humble leaders? Because research shows humble leadership is about behavioral habits, such as feedback seeking, credit sharing, all this that can be cultivated with intention, reflection, and personality insights. There are 3 overarching areas to consider. So the first area that we wanted to consider is leaders should work on evolving their self-awareness. Leaders need to be aware of their strengths and limitations. So the identified HPI, HDS, and MVPI scales Zaina presented can be used to facilitate an evolved self-awareness. Moreover, individuals need to take ownership of their mistakes, failures, and shortcomings. Sharing one's mistakes can be regarded as a unique strength. And leaders who share that they do not know everything and acknowledge their knowledge gaps shows them being human, and in turn creates better interactions and relationships with their followers. However, leaders do need to recognize the appropriate times to be vulnerable with others. So for example, research has shown that when it is important to demonstrate your competence, or when there are signs of one's leader authority are more uncertain by others, showing humility may cause followers to question the leader's ability to perform that role. But for highly visible leader roles, such as CEOs, top management, executives, in which there are clear external signs of authority, sharing their mistakes and knowledge gaps has been shown to have a positive impact on the organization or that team, and tends to lead to followers being more engaged. A second area in developing humble leaders is through modeling teachability. So when leaders open up about knowledge gaps or mistakes, they need to make sure they are also open to learning from those situations and learning from others. So they need to ask others for feedback, ask for advice, and then once they receive it, apply that feedback or advice. They need to demonstrate continual learning by taking action on that feedback, on the criticism and advice. All of this shows continual learning. Additionally, humble leaders encourage people to present new ideas and alternative perspectives. So how often is a leader encouraging their team to come to them with new ideas? Are they leaning into other perspectives, other viewpoints, And leaders should be open-minded to what others are suggesting and seriously consider these ideas and viewpoints and not disregard them. By simply disregarding other ideas, others may start feeling that they are not valued. They're going to share their ideas less. And so we really want to lean into creating this safe environment where others can share. And leaders can finally demonstrate their humility and model teachability by engaging in follower tasks, no matter how possibly menial that task is. So is the leader taking those sales calls? Are they on the floor with their followers? Are they taking on tasks that might be seen as beneath them? Are they accepting feedback from their followers? Are they listening to followers more so than talking at them? And then ultimately, by modeling teachability, leaders can create a culture of development. This culture of development and modeling teachability is further enhanced when the organization from the very top of the organization, also supports that teachability. And then finally, this third area that we want to point out in which people should consider as they develop into humble leaders is empowering recognition and development. So in order to do this, leaders should recognize and appreciate others' strengths and contributions. They should be aware of self-promoting themselves and taking credit for followers' accomplishments. So leaders should highlight work and successes as a team and spotlight others' achievements, using that we phrase rather than that me phrase. Moreover, mentor and coach others to facilitate their growth. Rather than focusing solely on one's own career trajectory and performance, humble leaders also can help other individuals with their career trajectories and performance improvements. So as a leader recognizes others and spotlights their strengths, make sure to be sincere. And I point this out because research has shown that if leaders are not perceived as being sincere, honest, and genuine in their behaviors of humility, followers are likely to have a negative reaction. And so overall, by having an authentic other focus rather than having a self focus, individuals or leaders can find themselves being more humble, demonstrating humble leadership. And we've mentioned before that there are times in which humble leaders excel and other times when they may struggle. Understanding the context will help a leader identify when to demonstrate greater or less humility. And we've identified some of these situations earlier, such as during crises or uncertain times, during when they're on teams with high power distances, and even certain countries that perceive humility as being less critical for the ideal leader. So if a leader finds themselves displaying more humility than they should at that time, then they may struggle making decisions quickly as they gather others' opinions, which may make them perceived as being indecisive to others. They may also be viewed by others as being overly dependent. And so all of this may impact their reputation. So leaders who decide to show humility need to consider how much humility to portray and also consider when they have received sufficient opinions from others. A leader does not need to consider a leader does need to consider how leaning into humble leadership could impact their reputation in certain contexts. And so while we've mentioned a few ways in which leaning into humble leadership can negatively impact someone's reputation, we do want to be mindful that this can also go the other way. So when a leader leans into humble leadership at the right times, they can see a positive impact on their reputation as they become seen as someone who cares about others' opinions and are flexible and are open to others' ideas and perspectives and solutions. So, in fact, a study from 2018 found that humble leadership had a stronger impact when leaders had even more power. Thus, as someone who is promoted up through an organization who is increasing their power within that organization, that leader should then consider leaning more into humble leadership. So overall, it's critical for leaders to not only know how to develop themselves as humble leaders, but when to lean into humble leadership. And so this brings up our key takeaways that we really want to emphasize as we wrap up this webinar. And so if you were to remember a few things from our webinar, because we covered quite a bit, we would really love it if you remembered that humble leaders can be confident and ambitious. Confidence and humility are not on the same spectrum. They are distinct constructs. Leaders can show humility and be confident. As someone becomes more self-aware, they know their weaknesses, but they can also be confident in their strengths. Secondly, a majority of leaders fail. Being a leader is hard, but humility is a critical component to being an effective leader. And research has shown an abundance of positive outcomes with humble leaders. Humble leadership is more about getting along rather than a focus on getting ahead of others. And context matters. As you lead your team, understand your team members, understand who you are leading and what kind of leader they need and value. By understanding their context, leaders will be able to flex the right amount of humility at the right time. And then finally, personality insights can help develop an individual into a humble leader. So with Hogan's unique perspective on personality, from a reputation viewpoint, an individual can not only gain a better idea of their strengths and limitations, but also understand their reputation as a leader and how they can better engage in humble behaviors as that leader. So we appreciate you coming to hear us present on humble leadership. And at this